Very happy you're with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Wei Chow. I am an IES program officer. I work with the National Center of Education, Science or National Center for Education Research, and I oversee projects that focus on K-12 teachers and teaching, in addition to a few other things like secondary writing and stuff like that. But I have known Jennifer for a bit now. And it's been really neat to have these connections about what other work is going on around the department, and also her work with those that are working very closely with the states with implementation of evidence-based practices. Hello.
Yeah. So put simply, Wei and I like to geek out on the research on professional development, professional learning. She's overseeing all the research. I get to learn from that. I get to, what else, the other things I've read, articles I've read, that kind of thing. So she's our kind of people. We're very glad you're here. You all know me, so I'm not going to tell you anything about myself today. I'm going to keep it all a secret, because I want to get right into the meat of it. As promised, we're going to talk a little bit about GEPRA just to get the conversation going. And we're also going to have you do breakouts so that you can talk with each other a little bit. Because the reality is, Wei and I can learn from the research. We can, but it's all hearsay, right? Like people are telling us what they're seeing, what they're experiencing while we sit at the federal government. You all are a lot closer to the work and you're going to learn a lot from each other. So that's the idea, is you'll talk to each other, you'll learn. Some of you I know just received your grant, so maybe there'll be more questions than answers, but you did have to talk about a fidelity measure in your grant application. So you've done something beyond just saying fidelity is important. You're already getting into that. What does it take to make it work? And that's what we're going to get into a little bit today. All right, so sharing my screen. All right, that's the presentation coming up. It's a little preview. Let's talk about Fidelity Fridays. So Fidelity Fridays, for those of you who are new, this came about from a work group that came together to solve the challenge of fidelity. Now, at least to give us some ideas about it, because Program Measure 2, which looks at improving fidelity as a result of your professional development, that's typically the one that we have the hardest time on, which is not to say we do badly. This is really hard to change teacher. Let's say teacher just for ease. We know we cover more personnel than that, including early childhood providers, but let's just say teachers. It's really hard to change adult behavior. It's really hard to get teachers to use these new skills. So I don't think we're doing badly. I think we are continuing to figure out how to crack a very tough nut. All right. So we are going to talk a little bit about the wisdom that came from that group I just talked about, previous Fidelity Friday learnings, our GEP results, which I've already shared. So I'm going to do it the fast way today, and be thinking about what's the low-hanging fruit for you in your state. What's something you could change right now and potentially make a difference with? We'll go through strategies that work. And specifically, once Wei and I start talking, she's going to share what some of her researchers are doing and what they have found where it was important to get to fidelity. And then I want you thinking about what you'll do with this information. When you leave today, is there someone you want to connect with? Is there something you want to change about your fidelity system? Is there something you want to change as you're setting things up because you're a new grantee? So those are it's all the thinking you should be doing. My favorite picture in the whole wide world now of fidelity is this components of fidelity infographic that was put together by the National Center on Intensive Intervention, NCII. So these are 5 elements, and maybe you could name more. If you could, please put them in the chat. We have adherence, which is what people typically think about with fidelity. What are your key ingredients? Are they there or not there? The next element, people don't think about it quite as much. Exposure and duration. How long do you have to do any of those features or those critical aspects of it? How long does it need to last? How often do you need to see those kids to make a difference? Quality of delivery. This is something you definitely don't hear about very much. Is it high quality delivery? How do you know what that is? Program specificity. This is, I think, to me, this relates a lot to adherence. When you're thinking about those key ingredients, what makes it different than the other things that go on, say, in the classroom? And then student engagement, we hear about the least. What we're learning in the research, starting to learn, is how important that relationship is between the adult and the student. If that relationship is not there, they're going to have a much harder time getting them engaged. Therefore, if they're not receiving it, it's not happening, right? It doesn't really matter what the teacher's skills are. So please be thinking about the order of importance you place on these different elements when you think about fidelity and training to those skills. And then what are you doing well in? And what area needs a little TLC that you could focus on after this webinar? So previous learnings, this is wisdom from the various groups that have gotten together and specifically that fidelity work group. Motivation, really important. If teachers don't understand the rationale behind something, they're unlikely to be motivated. If they don't understand why fidelity is being captured, why do they want to play, right? They've got plenty of other stuff to consider. Student engagement, we just talked about. Collaborating with teachers or whoever you're using the measure on. How about measuring with, right? Like, is this the right thing? Is this what you want to look at? Is this going to, so how can you involve them in the creation or the adaptation or modification over time? And then connecting to student outcomes. Program measure 4 is about student outcomes. The idea is if teachers use these skills, children with disabilities, their outcomes improve. Making the connection again to help with the motivation of the people who are involved. So fidelity challenges that came up from that group, that work group, the motivation and cognition, lack of time, internal communications, even with your own team and the other people working with your SPDIG, and having a fidelity tool that works. These were the main 4 that they brought up. So measuring fidelity, some things to consider. How did you develop your fidelity measure? Did you have an existing measure? It's nice for reliability and validity typically. Did you need to modify anything about it? Did you use a practice profile where you looked at what should it look like if it's optimal and versus, okay, versus no, that is not what we're looking for. We talked about collaboration, and then thinking about the ways of collecting fidelity data, observation being the most expensive, teacher survey being the thing used most often. How do you make that meaningful? Could you involve student report? And why student voice is important? And this is just some ideas behind it. It can improve learning. It can improve faculty performance, can improve the learning environment, students' expectations. So here's some of the technologies folks have used. That bottom one is a virtual reality environment called Immersion to get people ready to use things with fidelity. That's connected, this technology. Swivel Robot is on there. People have used Bug and Ear. Are there other technologies you can use? And then be thinking about what you want to focus on this year, because John is about to give you a poll that will help us plan our Fidelity Fridays now that you've had a little thinking about what might be tough and what might work.
Thanks for that cue, Jennifer. It looks like the poll is up. I assume people will speak up if they can't see it or can't respond to it.
Yeah, what do you want to focus on? How do you want to learn about the topics? Just 2 questions.
And I want to point out that for the how you want to learn, there is an open-ended choice at the end. If you've got any ideas that you want to share, please put those in the chat and Jennifer and I can capture that.
Yeah. And once you are done with the survey, if you could give me a thumbs up so I know if we can go on. Okay, seeing thumbs up. We're going to keep on going. All right, we are going to do a quick breakout. And this breakout is going to be, 1 second. I think we're going to do, 3 breakouts.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is going to be a chance to learn from each other about what you're currently doing with Fidelity. We want to have just a 10-minute conversation. about what's a current challenge for you right now? And what are you working on that you're hopeful about? So let me go ahead and put in the chat. What's a Fidelity challenge? And what are you hopeful about in your Fidelity work? And Wei, if you want to go to one of the rooms to kind of be part of the conversation, I'm sure people would love to have you. So we will come back together at 12:25 Eastern.
All right, I'm going to open the rooms.
Okay, cool. Hi, Kimberly. You're the first one back. You get the prize. I don't know what the prize is. Michaela, good to have you guys back. So do you feel more hopeful or challenged as a result of that conversation? I'm doing a, I don't know what kind of survey I'm doing, but perception survey. Are you more hopeful or challenged as a result of that conversation? Hopeful, thumbs up, challenged, thumbs down. How about that? Hopeful, good. In the middle, yeah, Kimberly. Thank you for the honesty. Melissa's hopeful. Okay, good. Well, thanks for having the conversation. I hope it was enlightening, or at the very least, you felt like you had colleagues who are going through the same thing. So real quick, I'm going to show you the Gepper data, and then I'm going to turn it over to Wei. I'll be talking a little bit with her too, but it'll mainly be Wei so that she has plenty of time to share her knowledge. So with the Gepper results this year, we did not make our target, but one of the evaluators, Illinois' evaluators, found something very interesting in the data that I did not see on my own, which is why evaluators are so important to our work. So Gepper results. For program measure 2, this is about improving implementation. So you can see 50% of grants that were in initiative implementation year 3 or beyond, 50% met the target that they had set themselves. So for program measure 2, improving implementation, everyone sets their own targets for each year. And we ask you to stretch yourself, but not make it impossible, right? And 50% met their target. 60% was the benchmark that we had set, or we had set for overall the whole program. So we didn't meet our target. But look what someone found is that if we take out implementation year 7, which I think we should, because that's just, things are different at that point in time. So if we just look at implementation years 3, 4, 5, and 6, so if they have a no cost extension, right? The numbers generally, if you're going like all the way into year 6, actually, here's better. So 50% in year 3, 40% made it to the target. In year 4, 50% made it to the target. In year 6, 75% made it to the target. So the numbers get better as they go along. And I think we're learning. So I think it could potentially be a question of how you set your target, something to think about with your group. As always, we talk about the reliability check, be clear about the fidelity measure you use, but the big thing is that bottom one is setting the targets, talking with your team and then your project officer about whether your targets are appropriate. So I'm going to go ahead and move now. Let's get in depth into some research that's going on that Wei has projects working on. She's the project officer, so she oversees it. And so, Wei, I'm probably going to skip through mine because folks here hear from me a lot. and focus on you, if that's okay.
Sure.
So turn it over to you.
So, as I said earlier when I introduced myself, I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective. I am a program officer that oversees research that's funded by the National Center on Education Research. Those are field initiated research projects. So a bit different where they're either, when it comes to, we're talking about interventions here, we're either developing the interventions or you're evaluating the interventions. And no doubt, Fidelity is a key part of their work because it defines then what their intervention really is. So we try just to give you a flavor for how we go about building out what it is, what we mean by the intervention and fidelity of implementation to that intervention. For any IES funded research project, it must include a K-12 student academic outcome. So we always start there because our work only has meaning if we have evidence that it actually helps the kids. So we require that. If they do not have this outcome, it will be kicked out and the reviewers will never see that proposal. That is how high priority it is to include these outcomes. So when I talk about, okay, how do we think this all works for any intervention? I always start off with first, what student outcome are you trying to improve? And then we walk backward from there. We talk about, well, what do you think actually helps a student reach those outcomes, reach their potential? And then moving back again, when we talk about trying to help the adults, right? Be one of those beneficial forces to bringing about those outcomes, then what does a teacher need to know? What does an educator need to know or do to then provide what a kid needs to then achieve those outcomes? And for a lot of the interventions that I oversee, also probably the interventions you all oversee, there are other players in the intervention besides the teacher, right? So it all depends on the nature of the intervention. A lot of our interventions are professional development interventions. So who is facilitating those components of the intervention? Who's doing the coaching? Who's providing all the resources, the materials? What do they need to do that then provides what the teacher needs to then do what they need to do for the students? So you can see as we move out of the system, starting with the kid out to the most proximal adult, which is their teacher, and then moving out again to what then the deliverers of that intervention need to be able to do. And then finally, the last piece that oftentimes, at least in the work that I oversee, is a bit tougher to measure, but still really critical, is then the surroundings infrastructure, the surrounding resources that an intervention would need to have even a chance of reaching fidelity. So that I'll be touching on each of these pieces as we go on.
Again, you all have heard a lot of this before, so it's nice to see it, but we're not going to talk about it. So
Cool.
Wei.
So one of the things that comes up often when I talk to our researchers and our interventionists is, what does it really mean when we talk about fidelity of implementation versus outcomes, right? Teacher outcomes, principal outcomes, whatever it is, whoever is supposed to be the one in the school that you need to partner with, the adult that needs to change their behavior in order to then provide what those kids need to reach their potential. What's the difference? Well, sometimes it's, for me, better to ask the questions so that we then can talk about who should we be measuring, what should we be measuring. Okay, so first, who is the direct recipient of that intervention? So IES funds a lot of research that's focused on, for instance, curriculum. the stuff that you give directly to the students themselves, right? The right level of reading materials, the right types of assignments, the right types of videos or media that then enhance, hopefully, their learning experience. So sometimes the direct recipient is a student. For a lot of the interventions I oversee, actually, the students are not my direct recipient. Instead, it's the teacher. We are trying to change what she is doing that can be observed by the kid, right? So anytime there's an intervention that's a professional development intervention or a professional learning community intervention, whatever it may be, we are actually not giving the intervention directly to the students. Instead, we're going through the teacher. We're hoping that the teacher will enhance her knowledge and or her skills so that then in turn she can provide the kinds of experiences that the students would most benefit from. Then we've got other interventions that I don't often get to oversee, which is, interventions that target directly the leadership in a school or the instructional leaders, administrators. We can climb. There are interventions that go after the people that hire, the people that then design pre-service programs. Like interventions really are about who is it that you're trying to change directly. And then the hope is that down the line, the change that occurs at the adult level will then benefit the kids. The other question to think about is then who delivers the intervention? Who is responsible for things like facilitating the workshops, the PLCs? Who's actually providing the coaching? Who's providing the training, the supports, and the technical assistance? Because we need to measure what these people are doing. So these are not necessarily the educators in the school anymore. These are the folks that are supposed to help those educators learn that knowledge, those skills.
And
Off,
wait, can I tell you a
okay.
fun fact about this group?
Uh-huh.
Many of them use a measure called the High Quality Professional Development Observation Checklist that
Uh-huh.
was developed by some of the evaluators in the SIG network, but they've just shared it freely with everyone else.
Yeah.
And it looks at how the training is provided, if they're using adult engagement, active engagement strategies, if they're
Yeah.
measuring skills, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
many of the projects are doing that work already. And many also have measures of coaching strategies and a coaching log to know what strategies they're using. So this is like,
Excellent.
so you know who you're talking to. They've got stuff.
That's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
because for a while there, I started working at IES about 13 years ago. And when we would talk about fidelity of implementation, it was almost 100% focused on the teachers.
Yeah.
It was like, oh yeah, well, they're responsible. Like, but wait, they're receiving the intervention. Who's providing it? Because that's like saying, well, why aren't the students being measuring up to the fidelity
Right.
of implementation?
Right.
Like that, what? They're the ones receiving the intervention. So that's great. So
Right.
your team
Yeah.
is already showing where the field has finally gotten to, where we are measuring all the way down that theory of change. And that's really important because oftentimes one of the reasons that a lot of interventions do not survive rigorous scientific testing is that they didn't reach adequate fidelity of implementation.
Mm.
So you don't know. You don't
Mhm.
know if, in fact, that intervention could have helped their intended folks, right? So you have to be able to reach it. Of course, it can also tell you, well, how feasible is this intervention then?
Mm.
If you can't reach it in the real world.
Right.
But you've got to be able to measure it. You've got to somehow get a sense of, okay, if we are prescribing so many sessions for how long with these folks at this time of year, however you're defining minimum dose, if we can't achieve it, we need to be asking also further questions, right, about scalability.
Mm.
And do we need to go back to developing or revising an intervention so that it can survive actual real world conditions? So these are just questions to think about as we talk about fidelity of implementation. So when I talk I talk to my researchers about, okay, well, tell me, how are you going to go about measuring the fidelity of implementation? And that goes to that graphic that Jennifer showed earlier. She said it was her favorite graphic. And that discussion about those different aspects of fidelity of implementation, I have those discussions as well with researchers. And one of the big things is I said, first, before you tell me how many sessions and all that stuff, tell me, what do you think, developer of the intervention, or, you know, uh, champion of the intervention, what do you think are the key ingredients, the essential ingredients and processes of this intervention? That if it did not occur, this intervention actually would not have a chance of working. That this is what makes it work and makes it different than business as usual or some other like very widely used practice out there. And for a while there, that stumped my researchers. They're like, what are you talking about? No, I've got a log. I can tell you how, that the teacher showed up and that we went in the order that, our guidebook said we should go in. Like, hold on. Like, okay, if you think that's all it takes, then those are your key ingredients. But is there something else? Right? And then you're going to start hearing other things that might actually start to matter. And then when I get to those specific interventions, you can see how you can build out, right?
And wait, can I add one thing? Because it was really interesting. There was a researcher who was talking about her intervention, and she's been in the field for a long time, does fantastic work. But I think she was so close to it. So she was explaining how, oh gosh, she was explaining like a master teacher, how she had used the intervention. And she's like, yeah, she didn't do it with fidelity. She like added a song and then she did this and she did that. But what I could hear was she used all the key ingredients. She made some adaptations, but all the key ingredients were there. It was just the how she did it was a little different because she was a master teacher and
Right,
really knew how to play with it. But
right,
the researcher couldn't see that, right? She was so
right.
close to it. She's like, oh no, she was doing a separate thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it can be tough when
It,
they're so close to it.
and it's actually one of the arguments that a lot of us make about having an independent person come in and ask those tough questions to say, look, I haven't bought into any of this. I wasn't part of the development. I don't make any money if this
Yeah.
intervention, gets into more schools, but I just want to understand what needs to happen. And some amazing work happens when you have this independent party that just says, but wait, I'm seeing something else.
Yeah.
And we should test it. We should measure it. So just to think about, okay, what is it that you think absolutely defines this intervention that makes it so different than the stuff that's usually done or the most hot thing that's out there now? What makes it unique? And that if it didn't happen, if it doesn't happen, there's no hope that then you're going to see the effects that you hope to see.
And you're getting into program specificity with that too, right?
Right. Right. Again, that graphic captures it beautifully because there's all these different aspects to try to figure out what is this intervention. That's really what fidelity of implementation in my eyes is. What is it? What must happen and how is it different? Because when it comes to finally putting an intervention through the grinder of science, you have to have a comparison group, right? If it's not better than what everyone else is already doing, then why are we going to risk the money, the effort? I heard from colleagues in the breakout group, yeah, like our educators are overwhelmed right now. To ask
Mm.
them to change means that we have to be able to make the argument this definitely will be better. Then what? It has to be better than what they're doing now, right? So that's why that program specificity has to come
Yeah,
into play, right?
good.
All right.
We're gonna go ahead and skip through this too.
Yeah. Yep. We'll skip through that. Awesome. So I just wanted to share a couple of interventions that have survived the evaluation grinder, just to give examples of how these folks went about determining what exactly are the key ingredients, and then what are some of the things that need to happen in the surrounding environment so that there's a chance to reaching fidelity of implementation. So the first example I've got for you is the targeted reading intervention or instruction. They've changed the name just for the eye. So I'm sorry if I had a slip of tongue. The targeted reading instruction intervention, they call it TRI. And it is designed for early student reading outcome. It's designed to improve K2 student reading outcomes, particularly for students that struggle with reading. And it really grew out of work with rural communities, predominantly Black in the South, where a lot of folks said they just washed their hands of these kids to say, well, there's just too much deficit. And so there's no hope. And so these researchers said, okay, we are actually going to build an intervention that is based on the science of reading, and focus on first, remember that theory of change that I showed you earlier, the generic one. Well, this one came to life. So they started off with, okay, these are the reading outcomes that we would like to see be improved. So what do the kids need in order to improve those outcomes? Well, they said, well, first of all, you got to have quality materials that the kids actually receive. So this intervention actually is a multi-piece intervention. It comes with a curriculum, right? Not all teacher-focused interventions come with a curriculum. This one does. It comes with specific texts that have been linked to levels of reading, whatever it is that they're struggling with, whether it's phonics or fluency, etc. They have already vetted materials. They've already built then the interaction that they have with these kids between with their teachers. This intervention uses one-on-one interactions, 15 minutes, just 15 minutes, with between a teacher and that struggling reader. And they just focus on that individual kid's issue, whatever it is. And their materials are designed for that kid, that level. What else comes with this intervention is that this intervention already comes with an assessment of where that kid is. They use stuff like the Woodcock-Johnson and the Dibbles to determine what exact skills does that student struggle with. So that already comes. The teacher does not need to then do testing and interpret data. The intervention already does that for them and then guides them into what materials should be presented during those 15-minute sessions. But the real, I think, uniqueness to this, right? Because there's a lot of interventions out there that say, oh yeah, these curriculum materials are totally in line with the science of reading. But there's the other piece. How do you help teachers make the best use of those materials, right? The teachers are not robots. They're not just like, oh, I'm just going to put down these materials and magically the knowledge will come from these papers or the screen right into the kid's brain. The teacher serves a critical role in facilitating the learning through their knowledge and their skills. So what do they do for the teachers in order to be able to do these sessions, these 15-minute sessions one-on-one with kids? Well, these teachers have to be able to first learn fidelity to deliver the curriculum materials to begin with, right? There's at least some process that these teachers need to follow to then deliver the curriculum materials as intended. Also, they are observed live during those sessions, those 15-minute sessions with those kids. And then immediately after, we're not talking a week after, a semester after, immediately the kid goes back to their small group or independent sessions. The teacher gets to talk to their coach and their coach gives feedback right then. How did that session go? What were some things that worked really well? What were the things that maybe we need to change the next time you work with this kid? That kind of thing. They also do other data collection, like survey of the teacher's self-evaluation of their literacy practices and their knowledge of teaching. And then it moves back one more step, because our teacher is also a learner. She is receiving this intervention. Who is delivering this intervention? Actually, there's two pieces. Again, active ingredients. One, we already talked about the coaching, real-time feedback through that webcam. Tons of teachers have talked about how frustrating it is to receive PD one and done, or if they do get a coach, it is not as connected to their practice as they would wish on time or content, whatever it is. They feel really frustrated with some of those experiences. So this intervention actually responds to that criticism. They also set up a collaborative professional learning team with teachers in the school, same grade, most of the time dealing with similar issues that they're trying to help their kids with. And they have that professional learning team to exchange then notes about that experience and then get feedback. All right. So that's the
Wait,
intervention.
wait, real quick. There was a comment, and just want to make sure you were aware of it, about family engagement. And
Uh,
if families are part of what needs to happen, which in literacy and most things they should be, what does that mean for the fidelity measure?
That's a great question. You're right, in this particular population, since it started off with rural, what they call low wealth, so most likely poverty levels,
Mm,
um, environments, majority African American in the South, definitely there's the thinking about what is happening in the family at home compared to what is expected at school. The original developer of that intervention actually wrote quite a bit about really the the mismatch sometimes of what is expected and really feasible at in certain family environments compared to then what we expect, the cultural expectations of school. And in this particular intervention, they're not going necessarily for the family engagement component, right? This is really focused on the teacher. However, that team that came up with this piece, the piece that has to happen in the school, um, they also have very much worked on, okay, then how can we help the families then carry on the key ingredients, the key processes that also must occur when it comes to helping a student transition from one cultural environment to another. Not to say one is better than the other, they're just different. They're just
mhm,
different. So, how do you make that translation? What is the role of the teacher through the eyes of the family versus what really actually happens? And how do you get those two cultures to meet so that they together will serve the student? So, that occurs in other interventions. They don't call it as part of this intervention, but certainly I have overseen projects that fold in the family engagement component, and it is very challenging work because that's where you start talking about, well, then what does the overall systems conceptualization of how a kid learns, how a kid thrives, right? Because you're now bringing in multiple systems, and how do you then have a comprehensive yet well defined enough intervention to then be able to make sure that each component has an adequate model and an adequate monitoring system to make sure people are getting what they should have gotten so that they have a chance to show their outcomes.
fantastic question. I love that. I mean, that could shape our entire year of Fidelity Fridays, really. Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Should
that's a
I move on to the next
yeah,
one, Way?
next one.
Okay.
So just a quick kind of set of lessons learned from that particular intervention, because this intervention has been going on now for decades and has survived multiple replication trials and also showed its limitations on other replication trials. That's actually still good science because we want to learn from times where we didn't show outcomes. So it's important. But this thus far, after decades of having those trials, they've learned some things. So besides the fact that they have these measures of how to capture whether or not the intervention was delivered as intended, I mentioned that they have live observations by the coaches of those one-on-one teacher-student sessions. They also have the coaches monitored by their supervisors, going over their logs, and they actually record the feedback that they give the teachers. And so those coaches get feedback about what they did. They also have coding systems. And like Jen said, this is one of the most expensive ways to go about monitoring fidelity. But the benefit is that there's less than put on the teacher, right? It's much more placed on the deliverers of the intervention to keep track of this stuff. So there's always like advantages and disadvantages to your approach. But the other thing that I ask my researchers all the time, because we do need to talk about feasibility, scalability, is okay, hold on. You've got this model, you've defined the key ingredients, but what is it that the environment absolutely has to have to even have a chance of showing fidelity of implementation? And this is where you really get into then the squishier topic of readiness. Is the environment ready to take on this intervention? So for this intervention, it's all remote, right? The coach is actually watching through the laptop or phone or tablet the interaction of the teacher and the kid. So you have to have internet connection. You have to have decent Wi-Fi because you don't want to lose signal in the middle of the session. And this is probably no surprise to this audience. You absolutely have to have buy-in from every single layer of the system, from the teacher, because they're overwhelmed. We're asking teachers to do a lot every day and more every day. School administrators, those are the folks that set up schedules and may actually try and set aside meeting room space or facilitate then any kind of internal school processes so that they don't get in the way. They also can emphasize the importance of actually doing this intervention, because if you do not have school administrator support, your intervention will have no hope of even getting to those key ingredients. And then, of course, district leadership, right? Things like encouraging schools to do it, but also setting up things that make it easier for them to do it. For instance, setting up more substitute support, right? Being able to set up continuing education credits so that you can take something off the plate of teachers instead of just continually adding onto their plate. So that's just an example for TRI. I don't know if we have time to go to the second one.
Yeah, don't. But
yeah, so we'll just say, if you are
yeah.
interested at all in learning about the other one, CGI, which is not about making fake things for movies, that's about early math. I'm happy to answer any questions when you guys, if you reach out to me. But yeah, this is just another example, and I'll just leave that there. And I think the rest of the slides after this, Jennifer, are just stuff that probably you've already covered.
Yeah. But one thing to think about for everyone is that this readiness and what needs to happen, that's the installation stage that we talk about. Exploration is figuring out if CGI would be right for you, knowing what the key ingredients are, what you're going to do. And then installation stage, you're putting together, you're ensuring that in-service credits are going to work at the district, you're working with the coordinator, the location. So that's that next step after exploration, that there are certain actions you take per CSEP, learning about this from research in their own work. And these are the things that you would focus in on. So we do have 2 minutes for questions for Wei. And if you come up with a question later on, just know that we can also bring her back or just email and get an answer from her.
Are there any tools to share, Way, that people could access based on, you were talking about how the project is years and years of they've been doing this for a while. Is there a place where they share their tools like for?
They actually have, as part of the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill system, they have their intervention, their papers, their some of their reading materials even already on their website to share publicly for free. In terms of their tools, I asked them to share them with me. I would probably need to double check with them that they're okay with me sharing out those actual tools, but they have layers and layers of fidelity monitoring measures.
Yeah. I mean, they would have to be adapted because they wouldn't match exactly what this group is doing, but sometimes it's helpful to see
Yeah.
a model and then adapt it instead of trying to come up with your own. So just curious.
Absolutely. And one of the things that the science of implementation science has wrestled with for a while is what components can have a universal type of monitoring and measurement system and what are really intervention specific. And I haven't seen a lot of work on that.
Yeah, I always think that is really an interesting area of work. So if anybody's looking for a new project, the combination, like some fidelity is about the instruction or the intervention itself and being sure it's being implemented correctly. And the other part is about effective coaching. Like, are you giving feedback that is clear and descriptive? Are you giving feedback that's timely? That's, whatever those other elements are. So those seem a little more universal than the content specific ones to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks for sharing all this today.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wei. We loved having you. And it's really nice to hear what's happening on the research side to compare with this, what they're taking the research and they're making it real in lots of places and states, these folks. And it's hard work, but it's nice to know what's happening in the more pure research land. So thank you for coming and visiting with us.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay. So good to see everyone. Have a great weekend.